especially when it comes to recommended policy that's reflective of the needs and voices from on the ground. We would like to thank all of our partners and extend a special thank you to the National NAACP for working with us hand in hand through the entire Roundtable series. We value the partnerships that have brought forth such timely outcomes. We would also like to thank the Union of Concerned Scientists for sponsoring this event. At this time, I'd like to introduce to you our President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, Mr. Colin O'Mara.
Thank you, Simona, and thank you all for joining us today for this incredibly important conversation. And look, I just want to start by just really honoring the incredible leadership of the National Wildlife Federation team. You've heard from Simone, you'll hear from Mustafa, but there's an entire dream team that we have of staff that have been really working on having great events and sessions like this all across the country. We want to have some real talk. Now's the time for transformative change. The violence that we're seeing, the social injustices that we need to rectify, the systems of oppression that we need to tear down, and build back better, and build back a society that's much more equitable and much more just. At the National Wildlife Federation, we're committed to becoming a truly anti-racist organization, to being an authentic partner and ally. And there's places where we do this work well, and there's places where we have a lot of far way to go. But this is the work we want to do together with each of you. We honor the work that you do, the incredible work in the grassroots and fighting the good fight. And one of the things we want to make sure is that the promises that are being made by politicians are actually resulting in real action on the ground. And ideas are fantastic, but we need to turn these ideas into true action and transformative change that are revitalizing communities in every corner of this country. And we have a moment in time to do that. I think folks are more awoken to the massive injustices that obviously are not new for Black and brown folks and communities across the country, but more folks are aware. There's a need for addressing the public health crisis, the climate crisis, the environmental justice crisis, the incredible health challenges that we're facing, and to address the structural racism that pervades so much of our society. If we do these things well and do them together, I think the next few years could be absolutely transformative change. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, look, one of the most important things we can all do if we want to bring that change is to vote. And again, not telling anybody who to vote for, but getting out to vote, making sure that everyone is participating, making sure that folks are taking that power and bringing it to the polls and creating the kind of change they want to see is incredibly important. And so on behalf of the National Wildlife Federation, we are humbled by our incredible partners, particularly the NAACP and President Johnson for his incredible leadership. And again, just thank you all for participating, and we look forward to creating change together, because this is the beginning of a good, big conversation to drive real change in the months and years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Well, once again, everyone, welcome to the National Town Hall on Environmental Justice in Frontline Communities, the state of the environment in Black and brown communities. We want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been a long journey, but I think we would be remiss if we did not take a moment of silence for all of those who have lost their lives to the coronavirus, and also to all of those who have lost their lives to gun violence. So we're going to take 7 seconds of silence to honor those lives. We also want to make sure that we are acknowledging that we are on a virtual platform, but across the country, we stand on indigenous lands. And there are many names, of course, to all of the nations across our country. So we want to make sure that we are honoring the fact that our indigenous brothers and sisters have graced us with the opportunity to actually be in the spaces and places that we are. And with that being said, real quickly, we want to just sort of give you some background on how we got to this moment. We've had 6 regional roundtables across the country, and blessed that we've had elected officials. We've had the leaders from frontline communities, those from the local county and also state governments, along with representatives from our HBCUs, our Hispanic serving institutions, our tribal colleges, and many others coming together. Voices of a number of over 140, giving the experiences that are happening on the ground, but also talking about the recommendations about how do we really change what's going on inside of our communities. And we were blessed to have a number of national partners who have been with us: the American Public Health Association, Amnesty International, the Blue Green Alliance, the Environmental Justice Journal, of course, the NAACP, the National Children's Campaign, the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. And we've got a summary of findings that we'll be sharing with everyone also that came out of all of those sets of conversations. And some of the issues that began to really resonate with a number of folks is one on climate change, air pollution, water security, our land use and our natural spaces. Also civic engagement, as Colin had mentioned, so critically important if we're going to win on each and every one of these issues. Education and supporting that. Food apartheid also, and yes, we did say food apartheid along with food justice issues. Infrastructure, how are we rebuilding our country and how are we making sure that it is our most vulnerable communities who are being focused on in that space. Gun violence is also an issue that still resonates in our communities, and we have to make sure that we are addressing that issue. And of course, the things that are associated with our public health impacts that continue to happen to our communities. And in this COVID-19 moment, and also in the impacts that have been happening for decades inside of communities of color, also the mental health challenges and impacts that come from the day-to-day challenges of dealing with systemic racism. All of these things came together and they are part of our summary of findings. We need you, because we need to make sure that we are continuing to share those policy recommendations that are going to be so critical as we move toward a final report. But we'll be sharing the summary of findings with everyone, so you'll be able to see what's been covered so far. It is my esteemed pleasure right now to be able to introduce our next speaker, who is Derek Johnson, the 19th president and CEO of the NAACP. President Johnson, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Colin and Simone, for your partnership in allowing us to have this moment to share with the audience. The NAACP, the nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization, we look forward to these type partnerships as we advocate proactively to improve the quality of life of those in African American and other disenfranchised communities. We also fight against discrimination. And I can recall when one of my predecessors took office in 1994. And one of the highlights that he brought forward was not only the fact that he was a member of the Wilmington 10, falsely incarcerated, but he had coined a phrase in the late 80s called environmental racism. That was Ben Chavis. And from that moment, I began to read more about what does it mean to have an environment that's racist outside of what we all know to be a racist environment. And the more I read, I realized that public policy was driving a quality of existence that was lacking. It was lacking for me growing up in Detroit, resulting in me having asthma because the air quality was not what it should have been in the community I grew up in, which was an African American community. It was lacking in quality in areas across the Mississippi Gulf Coast because when Hurricane Katrina hit, it was a result of systemic policy that allowed global warming to take place. And we had never seen such a hurricane impacting many African Americans across the state of Mississippi. I tell people, Hurricane Katrina hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast in Mississippi, but we've seen the residual flooding in Louisiana, in New Orleans particularly. And in that community, we've seen environmental racism because the theft of the oil industry took out of that state for so many years, not paying taxes and creating an environment that lacked in quality. And it was targeted towards African-American and poor people. Cancer Alley is also in Louisiana. And if you go from neighborhood to neighborhood, whether it's the water in Flint to you name the community, we've seen an acceleration of environmental racism, whether it's Native American communities, Latino community in the Brownville, Texas area, and across the country. This partnership is spearheaded because we have one of the thought leaders in African American communities when it comes to environmental justice, and that's Jackie Patterson. And we are proud to elevate the work of the Environmental Justice Committee to be a standing committee of the NAACP, because civil rights must take into account how our environment is being treated. I tell people that capital really doesn't care who and what it exploits. When democracy is weak, capital exploit people for cheap labor. But also when democracy is weak, capital exploit and rape the land. And it's the work of the National Wildlife Federation, it's the work of the NAACP to work in tandem to ensure that our democracy is strengthened. And as we sit in this seat of opportunity, looking at the November election, we must look at it with a value proposition that democracy must be strengthened. It must be strengthened by turning out the vote in numbers that we have not seen since 2012 to ensure we can keep capital in check and prevent it from exploiting the land, exploiting our natural resources, and exploiting people. But if we fail in November, we can be assured that the capital class will continue to exploit us all. Environmental racism is a very targeted reality for many of us. But environmental justice is something that we all should be working towards, because you cannot continue to target certain community and dump your poisons in those communities and not have an effect on the environment, the air quality for everyone. So at NAACP, we stand steadfast in our partnership with the National Wildlife Federation around that question of not allowing the capital class to exploit our lands, therefore exploiting our people. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Mustafa, for the opportunity. And I look forward to hearing the presentation moving forward.
Thank you, President Johnson. We appreciate you, and we most definitely appreciate the work of the NAACP. So now's the time. We're going to get started, everyone. We're going to move into our first panel, and we label this Our Communities, because everything actually starts in our communities. We know that we're hit first and worst, but we're also going to be focused on how do we make sure that we are first in line to make change inside of our communities. And I couldn't think of anybody better to start us off than one of the icons of the environmental justice movement, Vernice Miller Travis. Vernice is the executive vice president of the Metropolitan Group. Vernice, we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you, President Johnson. And what a fitting introduction, because I worked as the research assistant on that report, Toxic Waste and Race, for the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice for Ben Chavis and Charles Lee. And it was there that I was really grounded in so many areas of my life, and my work came together and helped me to understand that though I had thought I was going to be a civil rights lawyer, it was working on that report and doing research and helping to publish that report, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, that really concretized all the different aspects of what it was that was so threatening to African-American communities and other communities of color. How and why were we so set upon? How and why did we have disproportionate levels of every disease, shorter lifespans, less access to good housing, less access to quality food, less access to safe jobs, less access to open space. Even if we lived, as I did in Harlem, in between two rivers, we still had no way to get to either of those rivers for access. And what it concretized for me was the whole notion of environmental racism and environmental injustice. And that is that we are in the conditions and living in the predicaments that we're living in, not by choice, nor is it by accident, right? And so one of the things I think we need to just lift up and embrace, and I think many of us do, that the system is not broken, right? This is not a flaw in the system. The discrimination and the disproportionate impact from environmental harms and then the public health challenges that we face is not a broken or flaw in the system. The system was built this way. It was designed this way, and it was designed on our backs. And so I want to say a little bit about that as we set the context for this panel going forward. So systemic racism and race-based local land use policies and practices gave rise to the phenomena of environmental racism. For many, this would result in a lifetime of exposure to toxic and hazardous air pollutants from diesel engines, power plants, pulp and paper mills, oil refineries, and chemical manufacturing, starting in utero, at birth, and spanning across our lifetimes, right? So the reason that we have the disproportionate health outcomes that we have is not because we eat collard greens with fatback. It's not because we eat smoked ham. Some of us still do. It's not because we have a certain kind of lifestyle, but it's because the places where we lived were intended to do harm to us from day one. And that is harm from the time that a mother is carrying a child in womb, across that child's lifetime, through their adulthood, and then to early mortality. It is not an accident, it is intentional. And it's important that we know that. Sustained exposure to toxic air pollution results in frequently underappreciated environmental triggers of health disparities, from disproportionate levels of chronic respiratory diseases such as asthma and bronchitis and emphysema, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, to heart disease, strokes, and lung cancer. African Americans and other people of color who live in these communities that are adjacent to environmental threats and harms have higher rates of premature death from respiratory and other related diseases. This is our baseline day-to-day reality. And so now when you add the impacts of COVID and this pandemic to that reality, you get the extraordinary rates of, one, being affected by COVID and coronavirus, and two, premature death, elevated premature death from COVID. It has everything to do with the air pollution that we have lived with throughout the course of our lives. And so we've seen from the Harvard School of Public Health in a study that they released in April that said living in a county that experiences even a small increase in exposure to fine particle pollution will result in higher likelihood of acquiring COVID-19 and dying from it. And according to the American Lung Association, more than 21.2 million people live in counties with unhealthy levels of year-round particle pollution. Another startling data point that we need to wrap our arms around is that only 22% of all counties in the United States have majority African-American populations. I live in one of those counties, Prince George's County, Maryland. Of those 22% of counties in the United States, 57% of COVID death and mortality is coming from those 22% of counties. So let that sink in, and then take that data point and connect it back to where I started this conversation about the places that we live, right? And the exposure that we have to environmental harms across our lives. We get so used to it that we think it's normal. It's not normal. And it shouldn't be that way. And so hopefully the conversation as we go on tonight, you're going to hear a variety of strategies and approaches to what we need to do to lift ourselves up, to sustain ourselves, to create more sustainable communities where people thrive and not die before their time. But that there are all kinds of things we need to do, not the least of which is to vote and to participate in the political process. And I'll leave it there and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Vernice. Our next speaker is also an icon. I first met him when I was working on Capitol Hill, and I said, oh my goodness, we got someone right here who's definitely going to fight for community. So we are extremely blessed right now that we have Keith Ellison, who's joining us, the Attorney General from the great state of Minnesota. I know you're going to drop some knowledge on us.
Well, yeah, brother. Hey, good to see you, man. Thanks for having me. It's always great to be hanging out with you. And thanks to, the sister, I'm such a big fan of hers. And so, of course, President Johnson. So look, health disparities caused by environmental harms. Yes. Environmental racism. Of course, we absolutely can talk about the disproportionate, sustained, unfair ill effects that Black people, brown people address and deal with because of because of environmental racism. But let's talk about the need to make environmental decision-making a Black issue. Environmental decision-making, meaning that because we're dealing with more sickness, illness, and disproportionate impact, we've got to be at the voting booth. We've got to be at these boards of investment across every single state in the union. We've got to be in Congress. We've got to be at the EPA. We've got to be at state boards of pollution control. And we've got to really convert ourselves into environmental decision-making. Now, look, if you talk to the folks on this call, they're going to tell you that absolutely environmental protection is a Black issue. That's clear. That's the lives that we lead. But I would venture to guess that the pressing circumstances that people are living with, of wages, of housing, of police brutality, kind of make environmental issues sometimes not a front burner issue for the African American community. I know for a lot of people on the call, they're like, absolutely it is. I would submit to you, for some people it is, for some others it's not. And what I would say to you is that I was recently in a conversation and somebody said, you know, Brother Keith, you over here, start working on this environmental stuff. Is that really a Black issue? I'm like, well, ask anybody with asthma, ask anybody in New Orleans. Of course it is. But what we got to do is push environmental decision-making to the forefront of people's thinking when it comes to what are the issues affecting Black folk. Just as much as criminal justice, just as much as policing, environmental harms and environmental decision-making has got to be a front burner issue. For me, that means let's start talking about this election that's coming up. But let's look at the election not as an endpoint. All right, got Biden in there, good, check the box. No, that is the beginning of something. We've got to think ourselves as co-governors with the people who we elect and represent, whether they are school board members who can have a green policy, who can invest in everything from dealing with the issues of waste and zero waste policies, to the president who can help get us back into the Paris Climate Accords, pass the Green New Deal. All up and down the decision-making chain, we've got to have Black and brown people injecting themselves into environmental decision-making. You know, as Attorney General, you know, we're suing ExxonMobil, proud I'm doing that. But I'm gonna tell you why I did it. Native American advocates saying our rice that we've lived on for thousands and thousands of years, we can't grow it right no more. African American people living in North Minneapolis, right around where George Floyd, you know, was impacted, where he died, you know, come to me saying, we got more asthma than anybody. We're living near a transfer station. We got this highway right next to our homes. In other words, people directly affected saying, we're tired of just being the ones who take the hits. We're going to be the ones who actually make the calls. Where's this road going to go? Is there going to be a pipeline or not? What are we going to do about environmental decision-making? Can we get some people, some Black and brown people who may have PhDs or who may not, because it doesn't really matter, to get on boards where we're dealing with and we're talking about transit decisions, where we're talking about environmental decision-making, where we're talking about how and what are we going to study in terms of everything from asthma to cancer and all the rest. So that's the thing that I invite people to do in this last minute. I want to say we got to be environmental decision makers. That starts with the election. The election is the beginning of our co-governing with the president, with the congressperson, with the school board member. Let's get at it. Let's get on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney General Ellison. We appreciate you. We appreciate all the work that you continue to do to help to protect our communities. And as was said, you know, we got 24 million folks in our country who are suffering from asthma, 7 million kids, and we know disproportionately it is African American and Latinx brothers and sisters who are the ones who are going to the emergency rooms and the ones who are losing their lives. So that environmental decision-making that Attorney General spoke about is so important in helping to protect those lives. And with that being said, we are now going to move to Ernest Culverson. Ernest is with Amnesty International, and he's been the lead on the national gun violence campaign that they have been educating folks on and getting folks motivated to make real change happen. So we're going to turn it over to Ernest Culverson for 6 to 7 minutes. Brother Ernest.
Hey, good evening, everyone. As I said, with Amnesty International, premier human rights organization across the world and across the globe. And our base, our root is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in that, the environment is never specifically mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yet, if you deliberately dump toxic waste in someone's community or disproportionately exploit their natural resources without adequate consultation and compensation, clearly you're abusing their rights. You know, and over the past 60 years, as our recognition of environmental degradation has grown, so has our understanding that changes in the environment can have a significant impact on our ability to enjoy our human rights. And so Amnesty International, not only here domestically as we're picking up this line of work with the national wildlife, but across the globe, we have consistently worked on environmental issues and continue to push that. But in my space directly, as Mustafa spoke on, I'm the campaign manager for our gun violence campaign. And in this COVID time that we've been dealing with, this pandemic, which we see within Amnesty as our second pandemic, gun violence across this country was a pandemic before COVID-19. And in many cases was not getting the needed attention that was going on. You hear about a lot of the mass shootings, the school shootings, etc. But that day-to-day shootings that was taking place in our communities, Black and brown communities, don't get that national attention many times that the others do. And COVID-19 has exacerbated the issues and challenges that the Black community was having during this time. When you have hospitals or the lack thereof, you have a lack of emergency rooms in communities. But now they're dealing with hospitals being filled with COVID patients, and you still have to deal with individuals coming in that may be shot, individuals that coming in that may have trauma, emergency rooms, needs, and you're dealing with the COVID conversation. You're dealing with those COVID patients. And as we all know, the Black and brown, but specifically the Black community, has been overtaxed with the COVID-19 cases. And so as we have a strain already in our hospital systems, this is just exacerbated during COVID-19 and seeing the need that we need to make changes and deal with gun violence, as well as all of these other issues in our communities. And so communities dealing with water issues, educational issues, mental challenges, etc., are also dealing with gun violence. And so we have to identify a way that all of us in this space tonight and in communities that's watching, how do we connect those dots? How do we end up working together that gun violence is not a single issue, that water is not an issue on that side of the city, is education an issue on that side of the city? We all have to come together to figure this thing out in these Black and brown communities. And lastly, I'll talk about our current push. We're looking to get funding for these community-based organizations that many of you may know of, that's working in your communities, that's doing this gun violence work, that's helping to curb gun violence and end gun violence in their communities. But they are now getting challenged with budgets because local municipalities, local state governments are redirecting funds in light of COVID-19 and using that as the backdrop of why they cannot continue to fund these organizations that are not only doing gun violence work, but they're also now doing COVID-19 work, educating people in those communities on where to get masks, where to get food, etc. And so we have to look at that funding. And so we're pushing a piece of legislation called Break the Cycle of Violence Act. It's on Capitol Hill, sponsored by Senator Cory Booker and Representative Horsford. And so we are asking you can go to amnestyusa.org to get more information, how you can also raise your voice. We're looking to get more senators, more House of Reps to sponsor, to support this legislation that will provide federal funding to community-based organizations doing gun violence work. So they are no longer held hostage to local politics and local budgets. Thank you, and I enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Brother Culverson. We appreciate you. We appreciate Amnesty International being with us along this journey, and we look forward to working together in the future to make real change happen. And there still might be one or two of you out there saying, well, why are we talking about gun violence? Well, we know that when temperatures increase, gun violence increases. We also know, as Vernice Miller-Travis shared with us, that when you disinvest in communities and you create poverty, then also gun violence sometimes is attached to that. So as we make sure that our communities are healthier and stronger, we can also help to limit some of these impacts that are happening. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Sacobie Wilson, the executive editor of the Environmental Justice Journal, also one of the baddest professors at the University of Maryland, and also I'm blessed to say that he is also my fraternity brother. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Sacobie Wilson.
Thank you, Brother Mustafa Ali. I want to talk about COVID-19 a little bit. Before I get started, we've been talking about this pandemic, right, of COVID. We're really in a syndemic, and that's the word I borrowed from Miss Icon Vernice Miller-Travis. We had multiple pandemics at one time. We had 400 years of toxic racism and hate, right? We've had toxic plantation capitalism. I borrowed that from Reverend Lawson, gave a eulogy for Representative Lewis, right? We're dealing with toxic climate, we're dealing with toxic pollution, toxic environments, and we have toxic viruses. And don't forget what brother just said about toxic gun violence. So that is a syndemic. We were already dealing with syndemic in Black communities before COVID-19 came in to take advantage of that, right? And so why are we talking about COVID-19? COVID-19 has made visible the communities and populations that our policies have made invisible. And as Vernice said, our racist policies, right? Racism is embedded in the walls of America. You can't have America without racism. Racism is as American as apple pie. I'm gonna say it again. That pie you like, that's racism you may be eating. So you think about COVID-19, why are we where we are with morbidity and mortality disparities? Let's break it down. It's all been broken down. Vernice said context matters. It's not about your genetics. It's about your zip code. It's more important than your genetic code. Place matters. You should start eating more fruits and vegetables. I would if I had a grocery store. You should start walking and exercising more. I would, but guess what? There's no sidewalk. I don't want to get hit by a car. We have safety issues in our communities, right? You have to think about infrastructure. Infrastructure. We have communities that don't have good pedestrian infrastructure. We have communities that don't have access to food. I'm gonna talk more about food apartheid. LaDonna Redmond, activist in Chicago, said that it's not about food swamps and food deserts. It's about the broken, or as Vernice said, not broken, by purpose food system where some folks do not have access to food, right? Instead of having a grocery store, instead of having an urban garden, instead of having a farmer's market, guess what you got? You got fast food, Burger King. You got liquor stores selling groceries. You got payday lenders. So you got these pathogenic infrastructure, right? Let's use the word pathogens. Is that viruses and microbes? No. We have infrastructure that can basically kill communities. We have infrastructure that creates sacrifice zones, right? And so what we're talking about is, when you think about baked in racism, we're not talking just about environmental racism. I'm gonna tell y'all something you never heard before. It's environmental slavery. Let me break that down for you. Environmental slavery is talking about how some communities are used to host these lands, right? But then you get no benefits from it. So you're basically literally using my body as a sink for pollution. You're using the ecosystems, the air and water sinks pollution, but you're also, as Vernice said, using my body as a sink for pollution. You know what that is, folks? When an EPA permits a facility in a community, that is state-sanctioned poisoning. That's what that is. State-sanctioned poisoning, right? So as Vernice said before about air quality issues, we know communities of color are overburdened by these environmental hazards. Incinerators, right? Look in Curtis Bay in Baltimore. Petrochemical operations. Think about Cancer Alley in Louisiana, St. James Parish. Think about the Houston Ship Channel, one of the largest petrochemical corridors in the world, right? Richmond, California, dealing with refineries. Think about communities like that dealing with landfills. Think about communities that are dealing with concrete plants. Think about communities that are dealing with highways, y'all. Highways that, because of National Highway Defense Act, we called it urban renewal, but what it really was urban removal, where we're gonna remove Black folks from DC, Black folks from Durham, Black folks from Tulsa, Black folks from LA, Black folks from any community where you have a high concentration of Black people in urban areas. We built highways to those communities, right? And what did it do? We basically created sacrifice zones. When we burn fossil fuels, the combustion byproducts, you talk about asthma, particulate matter, dust in the air, what does it do? That particular matter causes asthma attacks. It causes elevated blood pressure. It causes heart disease. It causes strokes. It can cause Alzheimer's. It can cause diabetes. It can impact the development of your fetus. It can cause birth defects, infant mortality. It also can cause cancer and impact life expectancy. That's what's in Black and brown communities, right? That's that state-sanctioned poison, okay? So that's the syndemic. That's part of the reason why we have this disparities in COVID. So it's the lack of access to food. It's the overburden pollution. And then toxic climate, folks. Black and brown communities are not hot, by accident. Heat waves are hell for the poor and the elderly. Think about when communities were redlined, right? Black and brown communities were redlined as hazardous. Municipal services left. Instead, you got concrete and asphalt. So urban heat outlet effect. Studies have shown that red line communities have 7-degree difference in temperature than non-red line communities, right? Baltimore Code Red study last year found that even on the same block, if you have row houses and a house has a tree, that tree is gonna provide more cooling than someone who doesn't have that tree. You can see difference in temperature. So heat waves are hell for the poor and the elderly, right? That's an infrastructure issue. That's environmental racism, that's environmental justice, and that's also driving some of these issues when it comes to disparities in access, right? And disparities in COVID-19. Lack of access to healthcare, okay? So what we also have, getting back to this food apartheid issue, how are we gonna address that? We have to address that by making sure that we look at this food, energy, water nexus. You shouldn't have to choose between paying for your food, paying for your energy bill, and paying for your medicines. We should have a right to energy, human right to energy, human right to clean air and water, human right to food, y'all. Instead of having highways and byways, we need to have more greenways. Remove the asphalt. Get rid of all the cars in the urban neighborhoods. Do electrification. Let's make sure we invest in green infrastructure. Investing. That's how you address these issues around food disparities, food apartheid. That's how you address medical apartheid as well. Invest in communities. We got to make sure that we have a human right to clean air, a human right to clean water. We shouldn't be dealing with environmental slavery. We shouldn't be dealing with environmental racism. We should not have these disparities where Black and brown folks who are essential workers have to choose between staying at home and taking care of their kids or going to a job where they can die. I had a sibling who got COVID-19 because she's a nurse, 3 nurses in my family. I had a niece who got COVID-19 because she was an essential worker. She worked at a restaurant. We have to make sure that this plantation capitalism, we move away from that. Because without these essential workers, our capitalist system would grind to a halt. That's driving food apartheid. That's driving energy poverty, right? So what can we do to address these issues? We need to invest, and make sure communities are taking the lead. Back to you, Mustafa.
Thank you, Professor. We appreciate you. And for y'all who are watching, I guess you didn't know you was going to get some real talk. We don't give watered down conversations here. We don't give watered down solutions. We give real talk about real problems, but also real solutions that are happening inside of each and every one of our communities. And we're going to be moving forward here, but I'm going to go back to Vernice Miller-Travis for just one quick question. Vernice, we know that we have an election going on. This is a nonpartisan event. This is a C3 event.
Yep.
But for the next administration, whomever that might be, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the 1 or 2 things that you would request them to focus on to help to protect our communities?
First and foremost, to understand that civil rights enforcement is environmental enforcement. everyone needs to be compliant with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We wouldn't be where we are if there was vigorous enforcement of components of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that demands that you not use federal dollars or be a recipient of federal dollars and allow those dollars to be used to discriminate against people of color or protected groups as defined under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So Kobe just laid it out for us. All the ways that government and structure and systems are coming for us, state sanctioned. He called it state sanctioned environmental slavery, but it's state and federal, because the federal government has abdicated their responsibility. I'm talking to you, US EPA. I'm talking to you, Department of the Interior. I'm talking to you, Department of Energy, and you, the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, and you, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I'm talking to all of y'all. The Civil Rights Act requires that you step up and make sure that we do not continue to have to live in these degraded circumstances. So I would say that would be number one on my hit parade, Mustafa. And number two would be to make sure that we are hiring a diverse workforce within government, within the private sector, within local government, federal government. Of course, tribal government does that every day, but that government reflects the people of the United States of America, all of us, not some of us, but all of us. And since we're talking about the next election, let's make sure that we put that on the top of the list for the federal government of the United States of America. Y'all got a long way to go before you reach parity. How about that?
I think that'll do it. We appreciate you for sharing that with us. And with that being said, we're now going to transition to our next panel, which is focused on our health. And we couldn't think of a better person to start us off than the former mayor of Flint and also psychologist, Karen Weaver. So Dr. Weaver, I am going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you for having me. This has been exciting. This has been an exciting conversation, and it's a really needed conversation. And I have a little bit I need to say, because, you know, I've been listening and we've been talking about what's been going on and what government has been doing to us. And that's why, you know, when I think about Flint and when I talk to people about Flint, I have to let them know that Flint wasn't about water. You know, we've become known for the water crisis, but Flint wasn't about water. Water was a symptom of what we're all here to talk about, and that's systemic racism. You know, that's what Flint was about, and that was why it happened to us. One of the things we have to let people know, and I was listening to the Attorney General saying something about, you know, making environment a Black issue. And so we have to let people know that not only will they shoot us, they'll put their knees on our neck, but they'll poison our water. They will poison our air. They will build our homes on land that has been contaminated. And so this is done to us, and it's done to us intentionally. And when I look at where we are right now in the city of Flint, it scares me. It scares me. Because, you know, we were getting through a public health crisis. And when I say public health, I'm not talking just about physical health. I'm also talking about mental health when I say that. And it's mind-boggling for us to be in a place because this was done to us by those we elected to serve us, to protect us. And they didn't do that. They didn't do that, from local to state to federal. And I just heard Bernice saying all of the people she said we're talking to, we're still talking to them. We're still talking to you, because this went on in Flint, that we knew brown water was poison and that it was bad for over a year. And they told us nothing was wrong. We had to wait for a year and a half for them to come and validate our reality. You know, we had to wait for validation of our reality by other people that didn't look like us. And so I'm in a city that has been physically and mentally assaulted by poison water, especially when you look at what has happened as far as cognitive damage of children and the mental and the emotional stress that has traumatized this community. You look at what parents have had to go through, and you know, it's interesting because, you know, we're still grieving, and you might hear about the 16 or 17 people that died from Legionnaires, but they forget to tell you and mention the people that died as a result of pneumonia because of the water. They forget to mention the number of miscarriages and stillbirths that women had as a result of this water. And so all of the mental anguish that goes with everything we'd already been through, you have a heightened anger, you have heightened depression, anxiety, because trust has been broken, and it's been broken rightfully so. And then all of a sudden COVID comes in, and it comes in like gangbusters, and we're 40% of the deaths. And we already know, they talk about all these underlying conditions that we have. Well, we know why we have them. And then we're sitting here in Flint saying, you all haven't finished changing the pipes still. We're suffering from some underlying conditions that haven't even been identified yet. It hasn't even been identified. And so we're struggling with that. And what does that tell us? What does that tell us? What does that do to our psyche when some of us still don't have access to clean water? Some of us are waiting to say, when are they going to change the pipes, or are they going to change the pipes? So this, like I said, the city had been bruised, and now all of a sudden you go into a quarantine. You've got to be quarantined and separated. And if depression and mental health issues weren't already high, they went up more. And I remember when this happened, I said, this is going to really be bad for mental health. And mental health has been something that has been so stigmatized in our communities. And then we have lack of qualified or lack of access, providers for mental health services, for physical health services, when you're talking about providers that look like us, that understand what we're dealing with, and don't try to, make us feel like, oh yeah, something's really wrong with you all. So all of those things happened. And one of the things that we're struggling with is, on top of what we were struggling with before, is now, while grief, because, I remember there were days where it's like, I don't want to answer my phone. I don't want to look on social media, because you'd hear about, okay, I just know 5 people that died today, 6 people in this community that died today, and it just went on and on and on. And it was really, it did something to you, because we knew it was us. So then you layer that with an abnormal grieving process. Grief is difficult enough to go through under normal circumstances. But then you have it where you weren't even with your loved one when they died. You can't have a normal funeral service. You have all of these things that make that process just abnormal. And you have loneliness going on. You have the stress of everything else, domestic violence going up, child abuse going up, and seeing every single day how much Black lives don't matter, when you can turn on the news and you can look on social media and see them, shooting us. You can see them choking us. You can see people saying, where can we go get water? I mean, last year, we just moved a housing complex off of that had been built on a floodplain over 40 years ago. That was Black people. That's who it was. And we wondered why their rates of asthma were higher. Really? We've got to wonder that? We've got to wonder that. And so when you get to see this happening on TV, Blacks just being gunned down and choked and everything else, it gives you a sense of hopelessness. Do I matter? Does anyone care? And that's why these conversations and this education is so important to get out there. Because one of the things is, when you have hope, you're placing your trust in the potential for something positive to happen. But we can turn on the TV and see hope taken from us. We can see it all over social media. And I remember I was thinking about why hope is so important, especially when you're talking about, everything, but when you're looking at mental health. And I remembered this, and I wrote this down. It was something Desmond Tutu said, that hope was being able to see that there's light despite all of the darkness. So when you have a trust that's been broken and hope that's been lost mentally, where do you go? Where do you go when there's a lack of providers for us to get to? When someone suicides, it's because they've lost hope. And this is something we cannot continue to let them do this to us. And so I know one of the things that I was able to take as a result of this water crisis was it gave us such a great opportunity to educate the community about the environment and the environmental injustices that were going on. And earlier, I heard Bernice saying how sometimes we're living in conditions and we think they're normal, and they're not. But no one has even told us about that. And so, you know, we have an opportunity as elected officials, and you don't have to be an elected officials, but to put health in our policy, to make sure you go in those, you make people uncomfortable. Make them uncomfortable and make them hear what's going on and acknowledge this. And let's be about the business of changing this. So I just want to say thank you for letting me, you know, be part of this conversation and this discussion. And we need to do all we can do to keep it moving and bring us into the light. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver. We appreciate everything that you have done in the past and in this moment, and also in putting a spotlight on the mental challenges that many of our communities face because of the disproportionate impacts that continue to happen. So we thank you so much for your work. And now, you know, we're gonna pivot a little bit because we're blessed tonight that we have frontline leaders and we also have politicians. And you know, our folks, we appreciate a politician who don't just talk about it, but be about it, if I can say it that way. You know, someone who rolls up their sleeves, spends time with the people, and then translates what folks are asking for into real policy. So we are blessed now that we have the senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, who is with us. Cory has done an incredible amount of work around environmental justice, around legislation, but he also has been down on the ground, you know, looking at CAFOs, probably getting a little too close to those certified animal feeding operations. And just let me say one thing real quickly for everybody. You know, the beauty of Cory Booker is that not only does he come from where we come from, but he also stays connected to the change that has to happen. And when we call on him, he's always there. So that's why I'm proud to be able to call him my friend. And also that I know that he keeps it real at all times. Senator Booker, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Mustafa, brother, friend, yes. Brother, yes. You inspire me. You have sustained me. You have educated me. You have really you bring a soul force to what you do. And I just want to thank you for your leadership on this issue. And I know God's not even close to being finished with you. We've got a lot of work to do. And I pray a lot of opportunity on the road ahead. I want to recognize this gathering of leaders, both the folks that are speaking and those many leaders that are watching, that understand that those 10 two-letter words, if it is to be, it is up to me. And I want to thank Derek Johnson. I know he is such a powerful part of this, and as head of the NAACP, and you know there would be no me, no Mustafa, a lot of us would not be here if we weren't standing on the shoulders of the generational work that the NAACP has done. And I want to, of course, recognize with deep, humble gratitude the National Wildlife Federation as well for all that they do. And I just want you to know I feel this sense of urgency because many of us know that the issues we're discussing tonight are issues of life or death. They stand between misery and joy. They stand between injustice and justice. And overall, when you lay on this reality we've been experiencing for more than 6 months now, a pandemic, we know that this is a moral moment. And we know that folks who are often already struggling or in pain or who've suffered loss, we know that there's even greater loss and wretchedness being visited upon our communities, that this is not normal. And there's a thing about grief that we cannot just rush past it. Some people want to move on, but we must recognize that we have had close to 190,000 Americans to die from this pandemic alone. Disproportionately our elders, disproportionately Black and brown folk, disproportionately people who have to work, have to go, could not shelter. Those so-called workers that we call essential, but often still treat in this society as if they're expendable. Millions of Americans on top of that have lost jobs, who've lost small businesses. We know that this is a difficult time, and this virus has exposed so much of the unfinished business of our nation, so much of the fragility and the inequity within our country. And I believe that this should make us all, unless we suffer from a deep poverty, spiritual poverty of empathy, we all should be, as a society, expanding our moral imagination about what this moment is and how we have to make this nation be who we say we're going to be. And so I want to begin to really talk to you all about this understanding that you cannot pull and bisect issues of justice. They're all interrelated. All of these issues are intersectional. And that injustice in any form is a form of violence. We see the violence of racism. We see the violence of environmental injustice. We see the violence of apathy that allows such a level of injustice to persist. And so I just want folks to understand that we have got to come at it by seeing this in this moral way, and how our country cannot grow in any way comfortable or seek to go back to in any way a sense of normal. Because what was going on in neighborhoods, I'm sitting here in Newark, New Jersey, what we were seeing from our stoops even before a pandemic was outrageous. That we have a nation where we lead developed nations, we lead wealthy nations in infant mortality and maternal mortality. And then we see those issues in our country disproportionately visiting upon Black and brown communities, with Black women 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth than white women. We see this racial wealth gap that has persisted in our country, which is not an accidental thing. It's a result of purposeful federal policies that have had generational impact, like Social Security, federal housing policy, where we now have seen these systematically and overtly racist policies of our past create a reality where the average Black American has 1/10 the wealth of the average white American family. And these challenges, large-scale challenges, really mean that we can't have a piecemeal approach, that we have to have that expansive moral imagination, those expanded circles of empathy that really can address these issues with a far more comprehensive way, with a lot more commitment and less bystanders and more people who are working towards a larger justice. We need to center our focus on those issues of inclusion and equity and those issues of justice and expansive opportunity. We all benefit when we do that. And in this context, now more than ever, we need to understand that environmental justice is central. It is central to the well-being of our nation. It is central to our economic justice. It's central to our health justice. It is central to educational justice. It touches every aspect of our national life. When I moved to Newark over 20 years ago, I began to fully understand that you could not be fighting for civil rights or economic justice or even criminal justice and healthcare justice if you were not fighting for environmental justice. My city was a place where people had been robbed of what should have been their birthright: clean air, clean water. Now we had rivers that had been polluted, stolen by corporations of past, stealing them away from our present. Where people in my city couldn't plant in their backyards because the soil had been poisoned by those who were creating toxic environments. Where people who were literally being divorced from nature because of the actions of corporations who were stealing our wealth, our collective wealth as a society. We saw people who lived in this world where they felt that they could privatize their profits and push upon the public the costs of their doing business. I've seen in my city where we have seen people put into low-income neighborhoods the kind of corporate practices that would never be allowed in the neighborhoods in which the people who run the corporations live. They were creating an environment that they would not accept for their own family, really divorcing themselves from one of the fundamental precepts of humanity, which is love thy neighbor. When I'm here in Newark, I am literally sitting now within a 5-mile radius of not just one, but 2 Superfund toxic sites that were once abandoned by these corporations that have allowed toxic chemicals that have seeped into our soil. And we now know that children born in areas close to Superfund sites have higher rates of autism, higher rates of birth defects. And the number one indicator of whether you live around one of these toxic sites is the color of your skin. But I tell you, Mustafa was helpful to me as other activists in the environmental justice community, because I learned that my struggles here in Newark as a city councilman, as a mayor, were directly connected to the struggles all over this country, from rural areas to urban areas, from suburban areas that are being challenged. And I traveled with some of my friends and allies and brothers and sisters, going to Tallahassee and Uniontown, Alabama, where residents' quality of life was ruined by giant industrial dumps that were moved into their neighborhood without their consent, poisoning their families. I visited the bayous and marshes of southern Louisiana, where residents in that community were literally being driven from their land, faced with coastal land loss because of decades of industrial scale energy development. I stood in St. James Parish, will never forget the grievous experiences I had listening in a small Black church as resident after resident talked about the chronic illnesses that were being visited upon their families, the numbers of their relatives who suffered from cancer, died from cancer, but couldn't move because so much of their wealth was tied to the land that no one now wanted to buy. Centuries of policies in our country, redlining, federal housing policies, permissive zoning that allowed folks to move these toxins into their community, debilitating their ability to have any standing to fight against these big corporations. The challenges we face with the children in my community, the high asthma rates, the high lead blood rates. Every American should be outraged by this reality. This is all before the coronavirus. This is all before the current pandemic has shown us even more the failings of our society to create this justice that we seek. And so, no, we cannot go back to normal. We must normalize not the injustices we see, but we must be forces that create as the new normal in America, justice, justice, justice. I've been proud to work with environmental activists to introduce legislation on the federal level, to co-found the Environmental Justice Caucus in the Senate, and stand up to introduce bills that begin for the first time to speak it, to call it out, these kind of injustices that too many communities, low-income communities, rural communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, that too many are subjected to. I'm working on a new bill now that I'll be introducing this month that will help communities that are already overburdened by air pollution. I've got bills that deal with our broken food systems, so jagged edges of those broken systems carve up the spirits and souls and health of too many people. My new work will be about investing billions of dollars to clean up the legacy pollution like Superfund sites, abandoned coal mines, and the lead that poisons so many of our children's drinking waters and the lead paint in their homes. We need to take this fight up to make sure that any bills that are passing, whether it's the coming stimulus bill that we are talking about and fighting about, that it includes resources to go after these toxins that are threatening our children and attacking their well-being. My work and legislation crafted with activists in our community would ensure that no grants, that no permits are granted to new sources of air pollution in communities that are already overpolluted, like St. James Parish, and it will force existing sources of air pollution to be shut down in the coming years in order to protect the health of residents who are too long suffering. We can do this. There is a pathway out of the misery. There are a pathway to brighter days, to a new horizon. It's a pathway to our ideals that we swear an oath to when we say that we are a nation of liberty and justice for all. There's a pathway for all of us. And that pathway is possible, but only through our collective work and our collective struggle, because we know, as that great man, a former slave, said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Well, I join you in a chorus of conviction to not just demand progress, demand justice, but I join you in that fight. In that fight to make sure that we not just win elections, but that we turn and make sure that those elected people are held accountable for being with us in the fight, for prioritizing people over corporations, by prioritizing our integrity and our spirit and our ideals over any other perverse motives that for too long have undermined justice in our country. Thank you for this opportunity to visit with you tonight. I am grateful, I am hopeful, but I'll never forget what a woman on the fifth floor of the projects taught me. Hope is the active conviction that despair will not have the last word. Thank you for your activism.
Senator Booker, thank you. We appreciate you for your advocacy, your activism, and standing up and fighting, for our communities, often when some people, will turn and run. So we really appreciate you for that. So
hey, Mustafa, is it true, man? Did you tell somebody recently that if we pass that major landmark environmental justice bill, that you'll shave your dreads, shave it, be like me, man? I don't know. I might have heard, I may be mistaken, but I thought I heard you make that pledge.
Yeah. So when you get it passed, I'll cut the locks.
All right.
There you go. Right. Thousands of people just heard that. So stay blessed and stay in the fight.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you. God bless you, man.
All right, you too. And with that, we are now going to transition, but I'm going to do something that nobody else does in their town halls. We're going to call the ancestors into this space, because I think that is apropos for the next speaker who is about to share some words with us. So I'm going to call both Dana Alston and also the mother of the environmental justice movement, Hazel Johnson. We want to make sure that their names are being lifted up. And there is a reason for that, because Miss Monica Lewis Patrick has that same fight that Hazel Johnson had, that mother of our movement, if you will. And she also has that same intelligence that Dana Alston had in helping to structure things out and playing that incredible role in the first People of Color Summit in 1991. And yes, there were so many other incredible leaders, both male and female, in that space. But Miss Monica Patrick, Lewis Patrick, she is reminiscent of those who refuse to turn around and those who refuse to forget about their folks. So with that being said, I am now going to turn it over to the president and CEO of We the People of Detroit, Miss Monica Lewis Patrick.
Woo. Well, peace and blessings to you, my brother, Mustafa Ali. You have left me almost speechless with that introduction, but I bring you greetings from the great city of Detroit, where I have to lift up names like Mother Rhonda Anderson, who is one of our leaders here on the ground and also a national figure in the world of environmental justice. I have to lift up names like ancestor Charity Hicks, who was a major figure in helping us understand the connectivity between the water disparity issues that we were experiencing in Detroit and what was playing out all across the nation and around the world. And so as I'm bringing you into this conversation, I want to help everybody get a down in the dirt kind of understanding of what we're dealing with in Detroit. And then I'm going to connect the dots all the way from the state to the federal level. When you come into the city of Detroit, I need you to understand that you're standing in a city that built a well that provides water to 3.8 million Michiganders. Almost 30% of the state gets their water from a well that the city of Detroit built. In 1955, we were legislated by the state of Michigan to build this system out to the suburbs. Now let's connect the dots in terms of what was happening around that same time in terms of housing disparities and housing policies. What you were seeing is an exodus of white flight out of the city of Detroit in the 40s. And then you saw a second exodus of white flight out of the city of Detroit in the 50s. And then by the time you hit the 1967 rebellion, you saw a third wave of white flight out to the suburbs. Well, at the same time that this was happening on a federal level, what you were seeing is that up until 1977, the federal government was contributing about 69% of the dollars that went into funding your water infrastructure. What we have seen since then is a divestment out of that water structure to the tune of where we were once paying 69% of that at the federal level. It has now shrunk down to between 7 and 9% of that contribution from the federal level. Now, when you look at the city of Detroit, the other thing you need to understand that as we're spending $350 million for policing, we still are fighting to get our government at the local level just to put into a pot $5 million to keep water on. The other thing that you need to understand in connecting the dots of policies is we sit in a state that has a policy that says if you don't have running water for 72 hours, they can take your children. Well, what we have seen in cities like Detroit and Flint is that they have taken children. So knowing this, our organization in 2013, when we were charged by organizations like Michigan Welfare Rights, by one of our elders and our mentor, the Honorable Councilwoman Joanne Watson, these women had been fighting since the late 90s to usher in water affordability in the city of Detroit. Detroit, the very city that's providing water to a significant portion of the state of Michigan, was at the same time being legislated at the state level and the federal level to impose on itself the inability to provide water to its own residents. As the mayor said before me, as she talked about Flint, Flint got poisoned in the haste of the state government to hurry up and steal a major asset that was built on the backs of the residents of Detroit that actually provided some of the best water in the world. As a matter of fact, many people don't remember this, but up until the late 1990s, Detroit was an award-winning system in terms of municipal water management. Where we began to see the chipping away of the city of Detroit, because in 1955, the water director told us then that if Detroit's water system was forced to build this system out to the suburb and forced to sell it at a wholesale rate, that it would drive the city of Detroit into bankruptcy. Well, Detroit is forced to sell water to 126 municipalities and townships at a wholesale rate. And then those local municipalities mark those rates up anywhere to 1,000%. And because of the deep racial divide in the state of Michigan, it gets bifurcated into somehow Detroit is gouging everybody else. Well, the truth of the matter is right now, the city of Detroit is actually leasing its water department to a third party that can make a profit on Detroit's water system. And Detroit has been legally forced into renting its system back from itself. Does that make sense to you? It doesn't to me. So now what we're seeing in the middle of a pandemic, people are trying to figure out why is there such an onslaught of death and devastation and disease in Detroit? Well, what we were able to produce at We the People of Detroit, and if you go to our website, wethepeopleofdetroit.com, you will see all the maps and all the data, because we had to deputize ourselves. Because what we figured out a long time ago, nobody's coming to save us. And so in that deputizing ourselves, we figured out that we not only had to provide data and maps and science to be able to substantiate our arguments, we also had to teach policymakers how to represent us in a way that was producing equity and justice. And so a water affordability policy says for those persons that are in the federal guidelines between 150 and 200% of poverty, they should have a pathway to affordable water that is clean, safe, and accessible. That water should not cost them more than 2% of their income. We are seeing in cities like Detroit, we are paying upwards of 10% of our income for our water. You're seeing in places like Toledo, that's 45 minutes from Detroit, Toledo, Ohio is paying, their water rates have doubled in the last 6 months. You are looking at Chicago, that's only 3 hours away from Detroit, where their water rates have tripled in the last 8 years. And in Flint, what we saw prior to COVID, Flint was paying some of the highest water rates in the country at $250 on average a month, and they are looking at their water rates doubling. So what I'm saying to all of you is that we are not only in a crisis, we're not only in a pandemic, as was stated, we are beyond that. We are at a point where we are at ground zero and all of us must decide to take on some part of this fight. My mother is retired Master Sergeant. She is a combat veteran, and she told me in 2014 that shutting off water is an act of war. I would tell you right now that we in communities of color and in communities that are impoverished, we are at war with our government as it pertains to clean, safe, and affordable water. We must demand a water affordability policy. We must demand that it is connected to job creation. We must demand that we utilize policies that are already on the books, like HUD Section 3. HUD is a model for creating jobs, contracts, and training for communities that are most impacted by poverty. If we will take what is already there, if we will connect it to what we know from the ground up and begin to, as I said, mobilize and use what we have the ingenuity, we have the creativity. What is missing is the political will to get the job done. And so we're willing to give you all of this technology, all of the policy recommendations, but what I'm saying is absent is the political will. And so connecting that to the vote, connecting the vote to the judges that rule over the decisions, connecting those decisions to the positions that people will be appointed to is all connected. You can't just do one thing. You must mobilize. You must educate. You must legislate, and you must agitate. And we must continue to do all three of those in a secular motion till we get the quality of life policies that we deserve and the quality of life that we know that we need for our children and for generations to come. So I'll stop there, Dr. Ali, but I thank you so much for my time.
Oh, please don't stop. Thank you so much. That was incredible. That was so incredible. And that information, I hope folks will take that to heart. Shutting off water is an act of war. That's the seriousness of what's going on in our communities across the country. And that's why you have got to get engaged. You got to get engaged.
You can't shut off your water. You can't shut off your enemy in time of war. Now you tell me what time it is.
All right.
You tell me what time it is. 20 million Americans right now in a pandemic cannot wash their hands or flush their toilets. So I'm saying to any candidate, I'm saying to any person that is listening to this, that you don't have time to waste and there's no dilly-dallying around. We must have water equity and justice, and we must have it right now.
Thank you, Ms. Monica Lewis-Patrick. We appreciate you. Everyone, also, there'll be information about connecting with each of the panelists that you're seeing here today. Also, make sure that you are giving serious consideration to submitting recommendations so that we can continue to strengthen policy, but also make sure that you are registered to vote and that you vote. We're not telling anybody who to vote for, but if you get educated, then you'll be able to make the right decision on who you should be voting for. And that should be somebody who's protecting your communities. And with that being said, because this is the National Town Hall on Environmental Justice, if you know environmental justice, we are an intergenerational movement. We don't believe in siloing. We believe in honoring the wisdom of our elders, but also embracing the energy and ingenuity of our young people. And with that being said, we are now going to go to Diana Fernandez. Diana is a powerful young sister from Southern Florida. She's with the National Children's Campaign, and she has some powerful words and ideas to share with the thousands of people who are watching across the country. Diana, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Mustafa. I just want to start off by saying that I am so honored to be here tonight. My name is Diana Fernandez. For those of you that don't know me, I am from Miami, Florida, and I'm the Director of Operations for the National Children's Campaign. And tonight you all have inspired me and motivated me with your words and wisdom. And I am so absolutely honored to be here and be a part of this conversation. I don't even know where to start off, but I guess I do want to tell you a little bit more about myself. I live in a place in the Miami metropolitan area, a city that probably not many of you have heard of. It's called Hialeah, and I don't blame you for not knowing of it. It's a majority Cuban community, and my parents themselves were Cuban immigrants. They came here in their 20s to have me and my brother. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this, but if I could ask every immigrant parent that I know their reasons for coming to America, one of the most common answers would be to give their children a better life, one with equal opportunities. And when I was growing up, that's exactly what I thought I had. Opportunities I couldn't dream of and the world at my fingertips. The one thing that I didn't expect was to be on an uneven playing field simply because I'm a minority or my parents weren't born here. And this wasn't something that I realized until recently or that I was aware of all my life. My parents did everything that they could to give me the life that they never had, and they never told me when they couldn't pay a bill or when we had to take out a loan. And I never stopped for a moment to actually consider the sacrifices that they were making to give me such a privileged life. But you see, recently when the COVID pandemic began, I actually started to consider the impact that it was having on my family. My mom had to stop working completely for health and safety reasons, and my dad had to continue his 2 jobs. My brother worked overnight shifts, both as essential workers, and they never stopped for a minute just because our world was facing an unprecedented crisis that was affecting each and every one of us. And well, towards the beginning of the pandemic and the quarantine, I started experiencing some symptoms that I thought would might be COVID. And so obviously the first thing that I did was try and find a testing site. I figured if I did have COVID, the one thing I didn't want to do is spread it to my family who are essential workers or those who are immunocompromised. I wanted to be safe and I wanted to know for sure. So I searched everywhere in my county, I searched everywhere in my city, and I tried to find a place that would test me. Unfortunately, not many people picked up the phone because of how many people were getting tested. And those that did pick up the phone told me that, sorry, they couldn't test me because, you know, I have to be a certain age or other reasons. And so I was a little bit frustrated and, to be quite honest, outraged by the fact that we didn't have access to testing in a place that was so heavily impacted by the pandemic. When I was finally able to get tested, I had to go to a hospital, an emergency room, where I had to pay a copay. And I didn't know much about my family's insurance until recently, and I know that sounds like kind of crazy that I wasn't aware of such things, but I realized that we had to pay so much money just for me to get tested for a pandemic that is affecting everyone in the world. And my county, which has experienced so many cases, has testing to be so inaccessible. I don't understand how that's even possible at this point. And well, I was finally able to get tested about a month after I experienced symptoms. So I tested negative, which is great news at the time. But recently, I got a part-time job, and of course, they asked me for proof that I was negative of COVID. So the only way I was able to get tested this time was because I called in a favor with a family friend, and I got the antibody test. What they told me was that I had COVID antibodies. I had COVID, and I didn't even realize it because I couldn't get tested. And then we began wondering, my family, like, did they get COVID as well? Did my parents get COVID? Could they have put anyone at risk at their jobs? So my parents tried to get tested. My dad called his work, his insurance, can I get tested? And of course they took 2 weeks to test him. Like, we're in September already, 6 months into this quarantine, and we still don't have accessible testing, especially for essential workers, especially for minority communities, and especially for those that have been affected the most. So, I mean, if you're not aware, Miami-Dade County has had quite a lot of COVID cases, probably the most in Florida at this point. And yet still, like, our government cares more about getting money from forcing kids back to school than actually spending money for testing. I don't know why they haven't opened their eyes and realized that they're not putting minority communities at the front lines. They're not giving us a seat at the table, and they're not amplifying our voices. And to be honest, as many of you have pointed out tonight, my city, Miami, hasn't even experienced the worst of it. There are cities all over this country that are experiencing the brunt of this pandemic because of issues that climate change has exacerbated, like air pollution. So cities like Flint, Michigan, or Cancer Alley or Asthma Alley, these places are experiencing so many more COVID cases because of things that were out of their control. And what about all the immigrants that are stuck in detention centers where they are still at risk of COVID, and those who are immunocompromised are still at risk of COVID? So why aren't we doing something about it? Why is the government not taking into account how many lives we are losing because they are not taking the proper precautions? So, I mean, my community has been lucky that we haven't had as much risk to air pollution as many other cities. But still, I just feel as though my community is constantly left out of the conversation. I know this happened a while ago, but when Governor Ron DeSantis hosted a meeting with all the Florida mayors, the Miami mayors, why was my city the only mayor who was left out of the conversation? Especially when my working class community has experienced probably the most COVID cases. And it's not only that our local government isn't taking action, it's that and it's not only that we don't have access to testing or access to healthcare, it's the fact that we don't have access to basic information, not just information about COVID, but information about topics that are seriously affecting us, like climate change. Why is that a topic that is hardly talked about in our community? A community in Florida that is just widely affected by it. So I was thinking recently, why don't my parents talk to me about climate change? Why is no one actually taking charge and fighting an issue that is affecting us the most? And just recently, I read in the news that our temperature, our heat waves have not only been affecting us as people, but it's also been affecting nature and our sea life. Thousands and thousands of fish just wound up dead in a place in Miami, Biscayne Bay. And even though we have declared a climate emergency already, where is the comprehensive legislation on the table that is actually going to change that? Because if not, we're just going to see millions of more fish winding up dead, or people being affected by these issues. Honestly, it just feels as if though our governments, our local government, our state governments, and our federal governments isn't amplifying the voice of minority communities, isn't including us in the conversation, and isn't including legislation that is going to directly change things and change circumstances for our communities. So the first thing that I would want to see, especially when dealing with the COVID pandemic, is for more policy solutions. Why are restaurants and gyms still open? Why are people still having parties and going to the beaches? These things, as much as it might not be fun for all of us to be stuck in our houses, but what's more important after all, it's our health, especially in a community like ours, which is majority people of color and low income. So the first thing that we need to do is to actually take this pandemic seriously, especially for our communities, and to enforce these precautions and to enforce these rules. And lastly, I just want to say that it's very important to invest in our community because it's something that hasn't been done often. I know that this is a nonpartisan conversation, but the fact of the matter is that in my city, we're giving probably tens of millions of dollars to the police force, but we're only giving a fraction of that to education in a community of color. And that's just one example. I could list so many other examples of money being placed in situations where it's not as necessary as things that are impacting and helping our community succeed. So I don't want to go over time, but I know that I just want to say thank you again for including me in this conversation and for keeping our communities in mind. This conversation, I know, is going to impact so many lives and impact so many people with the wisdom that you have all shared tonight. So once again, thank you.
Diana, thank you. We really appreciate your advocacy. We appreciate your energy. And we appreciate you also highlighting the fact that immigrant communities are often forgotten and that we need to keep the spotlight on them. And also that the same pollution that is killing wildlife and damaging our natural spaces is that same pollution that is killing Black and brown communities and making people sick. So we appreciate you and thank you, and please continue to keep doing the work that you're doing. With that being said, we are now going to go to Mr. Hilton Kelly. Hilton Kelly is a Goldman Prize winner. He also is right there on the Gulf Coast dealing with the impacts of pollution, but also the impacts that are happening from our climate crisis. And he's a warrior for making change happen. So we're going to turn it over to Mr. Hilton Kelly.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you for having me on the show today. And I'd just like to start off by saying that, this is a much, much needed conversation for the world to hear. When I think about our conditions, our pre-existing conditions, I can't help but think about how systemic racism is the foundation for many of our inequities and the conditions which we suffer under today. I mean, after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, of course, African Americans were free, but free to do what? We were still being told what to do. We were still being placed in areas that were substandard for living. We still didn't have the means to take care of ourselves. We had substandard food. And as we ate those foods, and as we lived under certain conditions, which were mostly in the lower lands, like the Delta areas, where no one else wanted to live because those lands were chronically flooding. Well, then we became ill. We were full of bacteria. We ate the food that made us sick and gave us hypertension. And if we fast forward to today, as I sit here in Port Arthur, Texas, in the west end of Port Arthur, Texas, I can't help but think, have we come that far yet? Have we not developed to this point to where we all can have decent food to eat, a clean place to live in an area that doesn't flood? Well, it doesn't seem so because we are still living in those situations today. West Port Arthur is a low-lying area. I just recently went to Lake Charles, Louisiana, and I viewed the devastation from Hurricane Laura. Many of the African Americans are living south of I-10, still in those low-lying areas. As we speak right now, many people do not have adequate food. There's no electricity in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Here in Port Arthur, Texas, for 6 days, we suffered with no electricity. All of our food we had to discard because it has spoiled due to the heat. Many people that were mandatorily evacuated, told they had to leave. They left, they came home to nothing. Their food was gone, their money was gone. They had no money to buy food because they spent it on hotel rooms. They spent it on fuel. They spent it on the food they needed to survive while on the road. Now, fast forward to today. We have community of people still fighting, trying to get those dollars back from FEMA. But yet, once again, I feel we're being discriminated against because FEMA is telling us now that they don't owe us anything because, number one, we weren't impacted the way Lake Charles was. We didn't have any long-lasting damages. But nonetheless, many of the people here in the city of Port Arthur sustained damages in upward of $2,000 to $3,000. Many of the people here in Port Arthur, 80 to 90% of this city was evacuated. But yet, because we didn't sustain horrific damage from Hurricane Laura, and the damage was minor to the homes, but yet now people are being told that they can't recoup any of the money that they spent for the hotels, any of the money that they spent on fuel, any of the money that they spent on food while they were abroad because of this mandatory evacuation. Once again, we're being discriminated against. And I feel that it's because of the area codes that we live in. It's because of representation or the lack of representation that we don't have. It's time for us to learn how to stand together and fight against those powers that are just hell-bent on keeping us in substandard conditions. It's all political. When I think about the pollution that we had to deal with prior to Hurricane Laura landing on Port Arthur, Lake Charles, Benton, Louisiana, the pollution was so horrific in our communities to where it was difficult to breathe. There were shutdown operations going on to where the derricks were emitting lots of soot, lots of carbon monoxide, lots of benzene, untreated material, volatile organic compounds. And then days after that, we were told to mandatorily evacuate. And now we're being left out to dry to FEMA. Many young parents don't have any money to feed their children at this particular time. Lake Charles is still without lighting. Many of the people there are still living in other places other than their home because it's unfit to live in at this particular time. Because of our federal government, many, many years ago, locating African-American people south of I-10 in those lower Delta areas, they are the reason why we are still suffering from these conditions. They are the reasons why we still live in these substandard conditions. It's because that land has been passed on to generation after generation, and many of the people there can't afford to get out of those conditions because the land value is so cheap, and they built their homes there. And some of the homes, if they were in other communities, they would be a little bit more valuable than what they are now in the lower south end of the I-10 corridor. So it's time that we treat all of our folks fairly. And it's time that we look at ways in which we can get the politics out of the Environmental Protection Agency. The Environmental Protection Agency is an agency that was designed in 1970 to help protect human health, to help protect the environment, and to help create a clean environment for everyone so we can have clean water to drink and clean land to grow food. But yet it depends on who is in office that dictates whether or not we have an EPA that will be proactive or reactive. Whether or not we have an environmental protection agency that will look out for the welfare of the people and do what is necessary to make sure that all people have a clean environment to live in and clean water to drink. If we don't bind together today to fight for clean water and clean air, we'll find ourselves paying not $300 to $400 a month for water, but at some point it's going to be $600 to $700 a month. T-Boone Pickens is one of the biggest water hoarders in the world. And it's time that we look at ways in which we can take the basic necessities that we need to sustain life. It's time to take it back. And it's time for people living in those lower Delta areas and those low-lying areas to be treated fairly, not only by the state governments and local governments, but by our federal government, who stood by and watched the systemic racism push us into a corner and allow us and elevated us to be living in those areas. So let's unite together. Let's look at ways in which we can assist these people on the Gulf Coast with possibly being relocated, or help us to fight the fight to hold back the ravages of climate change, like sea level rise and also heat waves and the chronic hurricanes that are coming now 2 at a time. The time is now to stand up and fight. I think it's time for all of us to realize we're all activists, and we all need to be environmental activists. We got one planet. Let's fight for it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Hilton Kelly. Thank you so much for your activism and your words. And we definitely have to make sure that we are helping to protect the Gulf Coast, both from those emissions that are happening there and rebuilding our wetlands and our shores to sort of mitigate some of the impacts that are happening from the storms and hurricanes. And with that being said, I'm about to go now to the amazing Dr. Adrian Hollis, scientist from the Union of Concerned Scientists, also attorney, advocate, fighter for truth. Dr. Adrian Hollis, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you to the National Wildlife Federation for inviting us, and the Union of Concerned Scientists is proud to be a partner. I am so happy that I get to follow Mr. Hilton Kelly, because he has laid the foundation, and I'm just happy to pick up that mantle. And what I want to do is take what we've been hearing tonight, and you're going to hear me repeat a little of it, and talk about it in terms of something that people normally don't think about, the relationship between people and the planet, and why it's so important for us as people of color to have access to those spaces, right? For our mental health, our physical well-being, and our emotional health. So in the before time, which is what I call pre-COVID, the before time, I used to always open up my, any talk I gave, which was unfortunately mostly to academic folk and the like, that you can't talk about environmental health without talking about public health and environmental justice. You can't talk about climate change or climate health without talking about environmental justice and public health. You certainly can't talk about COVID-19 without talking about environmental justice and public health. And it's important always to make that, underline that point. Now, as you've heard already, systemic racism has placed us, Black and brown people and Indigenous folk, in areas of the country, the state, the city, and neighborhoods where access to natural spaces is almost non-existent. Instead, the view is of a chemical plant, a landfill, wayside and other polluting generating facilities. I grew up near paper mill, and that was the view from our window, of the property that we had. And I didn't see grass for a long time. I thought everybody had dirt and that they raked it regularly to keep the yards neat. So the people who live near hazardous waste facilities are already experiencing a lot of adverse health effects from exposure, including respiratory effects, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, increased heart attacks, stress, high blood pressure, and so on. Keep that in mind, because I'm going to bring you back to those same symptoms when I talk about COVID-19, because these are the same groups that were identified as being at risk from COVID-19. So on top of environmental contamination generally, add on to that climate change, which we already know affects frontline communities first and worst. Once again, we see the effects of historic racism, where Black and Brown communities are situated, as Hilton Kelly said, in low-lying areas that are prone to flooding, with or without a hurricane, or where sewage upgrades have been largely ignored, if people have a sewer system, or the ability to evacuate in the face of extreme weather is non-existent for a lot of people. Flooding in the US disproportionately harms Black people. We already know that in our neighborhoods. The lowest lying areas and neighborhoods without green space, which is important to absorb that extra water and protect us, those communities are often poor and often are contain members of minority groups. So we don't have that protection that green spaces offer us. Now add on to that COVID-19. Now, Dr. Wilson has already called it, it's a syndemic, because I've just given you 3 factors. So the pandemic itself that is COVID-19 has decimated Black and Brown communities and Indigenous communities. The CDC, if you went to their website, pointed to pre-existing conditions that make certain groups of people more at risk for COVID-19. And we had to clarify, it wasn't genetic, it's because of where you put us, because of the historic racism, the practices that the redlining and other practices that you engaged in. Some of the pre-existing conditions that were mentioned were obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma. Sound familiar? These are the same things that I mentioned to you as conditions that are caused by exposure to environmental contamination, right? So the conditions you've put us in make us more at risk for other challenges, other health challenges. So we know that Black people are 3 times more likely to die from asthma as white people, and that increases to 10 times for children. African Americans, the Black people have the highest rates of death from heart disease, and part of that's because of stress, because of the stress of living, of making a living, of existing, of surviving, right? When we all should be thriving. In the words of the esteemed Mustafa Ali. Black women and low-income women have an increased rate of premature births, and we heard Senator Booker mention that, than their white counterparts. And those premature babies have a greater incidence of chronic health conditions, including lung and breathing problems, which again puts them more at risk for other adverse health effects. So you see how this is a complete circle. So in our communities, when we talk about, and you've heard people talk about extreme heat, we have no way to escape. Going to a park where there are trees and the temperature can be 10, 20 degrees lower than in the communities where we live, which is mostly brick and mortar, right? But the distance from our homes to community parks are not walkable, or they're not safe. And they're not safe because of the economic oppression that we've been dealt, right? So all of this takes us back full circle to systemic racism. So lack of community and public access to safe, open, and green space is critical for public health, right? It's critical that we have a place to go. We can't have people who, in the middle of a heat wave, stay in your home and close the windows thinking that that's going to maintain cool. You want to go to a cooling center. You want to go to an area of town that's cool. And when we talk about land use, if I could do that for a minute, where we have issues around zoning, where a residential area has been rezoned for facilities. and we lose valuable property in that way, right? Or land has been relegated as unsafe or invaluable because it's, you know, and then given to communities of color, right? And so what they should be focused on, and they being people who create legislation, and I've spoken as a lawyer, I know that, what we should be focusing on is making our areas safe, addressing systemic racism, doing things like, you know, in certain communities, and not communities, in certain areas, for example, in downtown DC, you can see where city planners have created almost like islands of certain plants that take up toxicity and take up extra water. We need those in communities, right? We need to think about land use and natural resources and using those to benefit our community. In the middle of this new time, COVID-19. So we're never going to go back to normal. Everything is a new normal. And in that, and as part of that, we need to think about ways to protect and provide safe areas for our communities, for each other, for ourselves, right? Something as simple as building parks, building trees, increasing access, putting grocery stores, using land for grocery stores instead of using land for fracking or using land for facilities that pollute the community. You know, when it comes to clean water and clean air, I want to underline the importance of our green space, of trees and plants in their role that they play in providing us with clean water and clean air, with access to that. Not alone, but as a part of the greater picture. So I just wanted to underline that and take everything that's been said, especially what Mr. Kelly said, and put it in context when we talk about people and the planet, because things that affect us as individuals affect the planet, affect the plants, the trees, and animals. As a result of that, it affects us again. So everything comes full circle. Thank you, and back to you, Mustafa.
Thank you, Dr. Hollis, for dropping that knowledge on everyone. And we're now going to move to our next panel, which is focused on our vote, our voice. And we're blessed to have Tamara Foster Montgomery to kick it off for us. She's here representing Southern University. We really appreciate you. And I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Greetings. Good afternoon to you all. Of course, you all know that HBCUs are unique institutions and they have a powerful role in our country. And as a graduate of an HBCU, I know that our institutions are committed to the communities that we serve. We will continue to make an impact in the nation, the state, and the world. Our graduates must stay committed to our institutions and have a voice. This is an opportunity for us to work together and make sure that work and conditions stay the same. Each year, HBCUs produce graduates that enter the world of work, and they begin their careers with major companies and corporations. We can encourage those major corporations to invest in our communities and our HBCUs to support our programs and our students. We must step up. We must make sure that companies hire a diverse group of individuals who can represent our communities. We must make sure that we do our part and volunteer within our communities. We must hold our elected officials accountable for the communities that they serve. We must learn to talk to each other and not at each other. We cannot stay silent about the things that matter the most. The first step to solving a problem is to admit that you have one. Now that we know that we have a problem, it is time to do something about it. Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate each and every one of you for this opportunity to talk about these most important issues that impact and affect the communities that we serve. Thank you to the National Wildlife Federation for this opportunity.
Well, we thank you, and we thank every HBCU that is out there for standing strong all these years, even when not receiving the funding that you should, and still creating amazing leaders. And we know we talk about this new clean economy. We're going to have to make sure that HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions and tribal colleges are honored in that space, and that they have the resources that are necessary to make sure that we have the workers and the owners of those businesses. So that's just my little aside. With that being said, we are now going to go to Miss Holly Holiday, representing the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. If y'all have never heard Holly share this important information, you are in for a powerful treat. And we're also going to send up prayers and blessings to Miss Melanie Campbell, also the president of the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation. Holly, I'm turning it over to you.
Well, I feel like I am in great company, especially following Tamara as an HBCU grad, a proud graduate of Howard University. I feel like I'm right on time. I also appreciate and thank you for your healing thoughts for our leader, Melanie Campbell. I'm happy to be here in her stead. I will try to do her justice. Let me just say, we have heard the agenda for Black and Brown people in America. We have heard why we need to be involved in this election. We have heard how important it is for us to lift our voice on all of these issues. Now, let me share with you what we need to do with all of that information. And it really boils down to two things. One is we need to take the census. We have until September 30th to self-respond to the census. And although I'm mainly going to talk about voting, I just wanted to get a little sneak in on the census because one, it's coming to an end, and two, many of these funding streams, many of the ways that they evaluate who's in our community and the need that we have is based on the data they collect through the census. And we know that the census is a way that they use to eliminate people in our community by them not showing up in that data. So we need you to be counted. We need you to complete the census. And I encourage you, if you have not, take a moment right now to go to my2020census.gov. It's 10 questions, 10 minutes, and you're done. And that means resources and money in your community. And it makes sure that that lets us know that you are there. And that is regardless of your citizenship. It is for all people in the United States. So please do that. I'm going to spend the balance of my time talking about something that is most important to me. We've been running the Do To in 2020 campaign, which is vote and be counted. And let me tell you, voting has never been more important than it is this year. And if I don't need to spend any time on the why you should vote, because this entire presentation has given you the why, I'm going to focus on the how. Let me let you know that this is a year like no other. Not only is it important for you to vote, but voting may be experienced differently. What that means is you need to make a plan to vote. COVID has changed everything, and voting is not exempt from that change. First of all, make sure you are registered. You may think you're registered, so verify your registration. Be safe and make sure you verify your registration. And if you aren't, it's not too late to be registered and to get registered now in every jurisdiction. Secondly, be safe. We've already heard about some of the dangers of COVID, how contagious it is. Voting should not have to be a risky exercise. Use the option to request a ballot in advance. And then you have multiple options, depending on your state, to deliver that ballot. If you don't feel comfortable mailing it, although mailing is an option, you can fill the ballot out and take it directly to your Board of Elections and drop it off in advance. Many states also have drop box locations. Again, vote, but be safe. If you choose to go and vote during an early vote period or on election day, be prepared. That may mean you experience a little bit of wait delay. Be prepared, be ready. Make sure you have your PPE, your mask, your gloves, and your hand sanitizer so that voting is a safe exercise for you. Once you voted, because I know I'm talking to the world of activists out here, I've seen and heard the passion that you bring to our environment and the issues around environmental justice. Spread some love to your network and remind them to go vote too. We need you to take everybody that you're talking to the environment about. Those are the people that we need voting at the polls, because we do not want to be sitting here November 4th and not think that we haven't done everything that we need to do to be protectionist on these issues and to make sure that the people who we choose to put in office are not our enemies, but our allies. Mustafa, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm gonna keep it short and sweet and leave it there.
Wow, that was powerful. Thank you so much. Everybody remember those powerful words that Holly shared with you. Everybody talking about getting the bag. Well, you got a chance to get $100 billion bag if you fill out that census. So don't let your communities down, and your power is your vote. So utilize it. Everybody follow the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. There's incredible information there on the steps that you need to do. And with that being said, we are now going to transition to a bad brother. Giovanni Hernandez is a fantastic young brother on the West Coast who is holding it down in so many different areas. And we're blessed to have him with us this evening to share some words. So Giovanni, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, and thank you for the National Wildlife Federation for having me here tonight. Tonight, I really want to talk about COVID and education. Now, the first thing I really want to make clear is these issues that I'm going to be talking about, they're not new. COVID just pulled the curtain back on these issues. The first issue I really want to talk about is something that's probably hitting at home for a lot of young people and parents too, the digital divide. Access to devices is a problem now and has always been a problem even before this pandemic. But it's not just devices too. What's hurting students and families is the access to quality internet connection. This isn't just going to hurt kids this year, this week, or this month, or this education cycle. It's going to hurt them in the long run. We need to make sure our states, our localities, our school boards, and our federal government is funding technology and access to internet. Because this isn't a problem about if students should have access, it's they need this access, especially Black and Brown communities. We need this access to succeed. Another issue that I really want to talk about is funding. There is no doubt that schools need to be funded. Schools and communities need to be funded because that is simply what we should be doing, not as a country, but as a society, as a world. Our communities deserve funding. In the previous months and the months ahead, we're going to be talking about issues of social justice. The months behind us really just showed us the emphasis we need to put on social justice. They show us that we need to look at the problems that have targeted our education system. And the one I really want to talk about is Eurocentric curriculum. That has been a leading problem in our education system. We are teaching young Black and Brown students to learn history that isn't reflective of theirs. How are you going to expect a student to learn a history when they aren't learning about theirs? If we are going to learn about our history, it has to be everyone, no matter your skin tone, no matter where you come from. Our history must be included in curriculum. Our education is supposed to be the gateway to our future. Well, we need to actually put our money where our mouth is and actually start investing in students, our communities, and our families at home. Now, something that I really want to just say is that these systematic problems that exist, they're not new. They weren't created 10 years ago. They were embedded in the DNA of America. That's just the reality of it. We need to hit home where it's been hitting us, at school, at our work, at our parks, in the environment that isn't being cleaned for us. That's simply what we need to do. We need to stand up together. We need to vote. We need to fill out the census. We need to do everything possible so government invests in us. We're willing to invest in ourselves, but government needs to take that action. So I really hope all of you just target your elected officials, email them, write to them, call them. That doesn't mean you're annoying them. That means you're doing your civic duty and putting them on the spot. That's our responsibility as citizens, not just citizens for voting measures, but citizens of this country, being active participants in a democracy. We know that racism, the inequities that exist in education and every other system, they're in the foundation of this country. And together we need to make this a more inclusive society, especially for our Black and Brown communities. That's simply what we need to do. This isn't more of a call to action. This is more of a call to unity as well. Something that I really want to emphasize that Mustafa mentioned earlier is this is intergenerational. Everyone is part of this conversation. These issues, the issues that have hurt generations before us, are going to keep hurting us again. It's time we actually address these issues. And to the people watching at home, just know this isn't just about me or about the other people that are just here. This is about all of us. This is truly a conversation for everyone. So I hope you get active, you get involved, you call your local representatives and you tell them how it is, how society is and how racism is, because you know the experience. So let them know too. And now I'll take it back to Mustafa.
Brother Giovanni Hernandez, thank you so much. You are incredible. Thank you for your words of unity, but also a focus about how we can make real change happen together. And with that being said, we are now going to go to our final speaker for this panel, our closing panel, Keister Wheeler, the Assistant Secretary of State for Michigan. Brother Wheeler, I am now going to turn it over to you.
It is my pleasure, Brother Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. I love your energy. You have been hanging in there, my man. I want to, first of all, let you know how excited I am to be in this moment. When I look at all of the protests and demonstrations that are taking place in all 50 states across this country and 60 plus states across this world, I am encouraged. I think we are in a moment that none of us have ever seen and none of us could have imagined. I think while we acknowledge that COVID-19 is a pandemic and we have declared a state of emergency, we also recognize the need to acknowledge that poverty is a pandemic and we still have to declare a state of emergency. We also know that racism and rogue policing is in fact a pandemic and we demand that the world declares a state of emergency. So I just want you to know that I am encouraged. If you don't hear anything else that I say, when people ask how long we fight, there's only one answer. We fight until we win. It's real simple. I believe the very best way to predict the future is to create it. And I know that where we live should never determine if we live or die. I am encouraged. I am honored to serve as your Assistant Secretary of State here in Michigan. We've got some new voting rights here in Michigan. And speaking of Michigan, let me just do a quick shout out. First of all, let me acknowledge Brother Giovanni. He's got a little swag. You would almost think he might be a Detroit boy. He's just cool. And I appreciate all of your encouragement, all of your remarks, Brother Giovanni. But let me acknowledge all of my Michigan colleagues, Brother Derek Johnson, Mayor Karen Weaver, and Brother Ernest Culverson, Simone Lightfoot, and Miss Monica Patrick. You know, all of those are my Michigan colleagues. They may be in different parts of the world now, but you could feel that Michigan in their blood. But we've got a new set of voting rights here in Michigan. No excuse absentee voting, same-day voter registration. And we have participated in so many protests and demonstrations. And what we are encouraging all of our residents to just be reminded of is we have to continue to move from protest to power. Voting is our power. We have to move from agony to action. Voting is that action that we must all live. This COVID-19 reality has created really some opportunities for us. We are encouraging young people, particularly those of you who are in your 20s and 30s, we need you to be the new election workers. We need you to be the new poll workers. Those of us, or I should say those of you who are over 50, I'm somewhere there, but many of us who live with these compromised immune systems, we're not the ones who should be working the polls. We should take advantage of this opportunity to vote from the comfort of our homes, no excuse absentee voting. And let me just add one dose of clarity. Many of you probably understand this. Your president is talking about he's opposed to vote by mail. He's creating chaos in the post office. So a lot of folk have already articulated some of the benefits to voting from home. But if you don't know the difference between vote by mail and voting absentee ballot, two things distinguish what vote by mail mean. If you're in a vote by mail state, that means there are no polling places. It also means everybody gets a ballot. If you have to make application for a ballot, you're not a vote by mail state. If you have polling places, you're not a vote by mail state, but you will still take advantage of voting by absentee ballot. In Michigan, we had 2.5 million people vote. 1.6 voted by by mail via the absentee process. They voted from the comfort of their homes. African Americans and communities of color, we tend to like to go to the poll and slide our ballot into that machine. We're saying in this COVID-19 environment, vote from the comfort of your home, take advantage of ballot boxes, take advantage of ballot tracking. There is new technology available. One of the best relationships all of you can have on the way to election day is with your local clerk. Make sure that there's ample PPE equipment, and raise your voice in this moment. And I guess I'll conclude by simply saying a couple of things: voting, entrepreneurialism, education, health and wellness. Those are the cornerstones to our future. In spite of all the challenges that we have, I am so encouraged when I see so many young people that are industry, black and white, brown and yellow, taking it to the man. Rogue policing is unacceptable. Since the murder of George Floyd, at least one African-American has been shot or killed by rogue police officers across this country every week. Every week. That's unacceptable. Somebody ought to be mad. Somebody ought to do something. And I am saying when you vote, you do something. Brother Mustafa Ali, thank you so very much for having me. And let's fight until we win. Thank you.
Assistant Secretary Wheeler, thank you so much for all that you continue to do also. Well, we have come to the end of our journey to a degree. I just want to remind folks of a couple of things real quickly. I want to make sure that everybody gets a copy of the summary of findings, the COVID-19 Environmental Justice Roundtable series. Make sure you get that. It talks about all of the roundtables, the regional roundtables to date, leading us up to this national town hall, but our work is not done. We also need you to submit your recommendations, those policy recommendations around environmental justice, around climate change, around addressing systemic racism, around housing and job creation, and all the other things that we talked about tonight. We still have responsibility in this space. I also want to thank all of our national partners, the American Public Health Association, Amnesty International, the Blue Green Alliance, the National Children's Campaign, the Coalition on Black Civic Participation, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and of course, the Environmental Justice Journal. And we also just want to remind folks that your recommendations are going to go into this final report. And that final report will be shared with folks on Capitol Hill, will be shared with folks in the state houses, will be shared with the new administration in 2021 to make sure that we are holding people accountable. And we are also sharing all of these voices that have come from across our country. And remember these last parting words: you have power unless you give it away. So our power is tied up in our vote. Make sure that all the folks who share with you the steps that are necessary, that you do it. Make sure that you're also filling out that census to make sure that your communities get the resources that are so critical to build that infrastructure that we talked about. And let's make sure, as Giovanni and others shared with us, that we are coming together. We are coming together to make the change that is necessary to dismantle systemic racism, but also to build our communities so that they are healthier and stronger and that they are more equitable. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in, the thousands of people across the country and those who will watch this video as it's being rebroadcast, because we have power and we are going to make sure that change happens. Everyone have a blessed and safe evening, and we'll talk to you soon.